On the morning of September 11, 2001, the United States experienced the deadliest terrorist attack in its history. It began like an ordinary Tuesday morning. Millions of Americans were heading to work, attending school, or starting their daily routines when 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked by terrorists connected to the extremist group Al-Qaeda. Within hours, the world would change forever. At 8:46 a.m., the first hijacked plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Smoke and flames erupted from the building as stunned witnesses struggled to understand what had happened. Many initially believed it was a tragic accident. But 17 minutes later, a second airplane slammed into the South Tower live on television in front of millions of viewers around the world. Panic spread instantly. It became clear that the United States was under attack. As emergency responders rushed into the burning towers, another hijacked plane crashed into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American military. A fourth aircraft, believed to be heading toward Washington, D.C., crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. Firefighters, police officers, office workers, airline passengers, and civilians from dozens of countries lost their lives during the attacks. Thousands more were injured while millions watched the horror unfold live on television. Then came one of the most shocking moments in modern history. The Twin Towers collapsed. Massive clouds of smoke and debris consumed lower Manhattan as the skyline of New York City changed forever. The destruction stunned the world and created an atmosphere of fear, anger, and grief across the United States. America demanded answers. Who carried out the attacks? Why had they targeted civilians on such a massive scale? And how could the United States respond to prevent another catastrophe? Very quickly, attention focused on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. American intelligence agencies determined the terrorist network had planned and organized the attacks from bases inside Afghanistan. At the time, Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban, an extremist regime that had ruled much of the country since the 1990s. The Taliban provided safe haven to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda leadership. The group refused international pressure to surrender him to the United States. Taliban leaders demanded evidence of bin Laden's involvement while warning that foreign military intervention could trigger war. Inside America, emotions were overwhelming. The attacks created enormous fear of future terrorism. Airports shut down, security measures intensified, and rumors of additional attacks spread rapidly. Citizens gathered at memorials, churches, and public spaces while rescue workers searched the ruins of the World Trade Center for survivors. The atmosphere in Washington became urgent and tense. President George W. Bush addressed the nation, promising that those responsible for the attacks would be found and punished. Soon afterward, Bush declared a new global campaign called the War on Terror. Its objective extended beyond simply capturing those involved in 9/11. American leaders argued that terrorist organizations and governments supporting them represented a worldwide threat requiring military action, intelligence operations, and international cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Support for the United States spread globally. For the first time in history, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization invoked Article 5 of its treaty, declaring that an attack against one member nation was an attack against all. Countries across Europe and beyond offered military, intelligence, and logistical support. Meanwhile, American military forces began preparing for war. Aircraft carriers moved into position. Bombers, special operations units, and intelligence teams prepared for deployment while military planners developed strategies for invading Afghanistan and destroying Al-Qaeda's infrastructure. The operation would become known as Operation Enduring Freedom. Its goals were clear: destroy Al-Qaeda, remove Taliban protection for terrorists, and prevent Afghanistan from remaining a base for future attacks against the United States and its allies. But Afghanistan presented enormous challenges. The country's harsh mountains, tribal networks, difficult terrain, and long history of resisting foreign invasions made it one of the most dangerous battlefields in the world. Previous superpowers, including the Soviet Union, had struggled unsuccessfully to control Afghanistan during earlier conflicts. Still, after September 11, the United States was determined to act. Public anger remained intense while demands for justice dominated American politics. Many citizens believed military action was necessary not only to punish those responsible but also to demonstrate that attacks on the United States would not go unanswered. Within weeks of September 11, American forces were preparing to enter Afghanistan. What began as a response to the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history was about to evolve into a conflict lasting nearly 20 years, the longest war in American history. And as Operation Enduring Freedom officially began, Few people realized how deeply the war would reshape global politics, counterterrorism, and the future of the modern world. By October 2001, less than a month after the September 11th attacks, the United States was ready to strike Afghanistan. The objective was clear. American leaders wanted to destroy Al-Qaeda, capture or kill Osama bin Laden, and remove the Taliban government that had allowed terrorist groups to operate inside the country. The operation officially began on October 7, 2001. As darkness fell over Afghanistan, cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs launched from American warships and aircraft struck Taliban military targets across the country. Explosions lit up the skies above Kabul, Kandahar, and other Taliban-controlled cities as Operation Enduring Freedom entered its first stage. The invasion combined overwhelming air power with covert ground operations. Unlike traditional large-scale invasions, the United States initially relied heavily on special operations forces, intelligence teams, and Afghan allies already fighting against the Taliban. Before major troop deployments arrived, small teams from the Central Intelligence Agency secretly entered Afghanistan. CIA operatives established contact with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of anti-Taliban Afghan fighters that had been battling Taliban forces for years. These local fighters knew the terrain, tribal networks, and mountain regions far better than foreign troops. Soon afterward, American special forces followed. Green Berets and other elite units traveled deep into Afghanistan on horseback, pickup trucks, and helicopters alongside Northern Alliance commanders. Their role was to coordinate airstrikes, gather intelligence, and direct attacks against Taliban positions. The strategy proved devastatingly effective. Using satellite communications, laser targeting systems, and advanced surveillance technology, small American teams guided massive airstrikes onto Taliban military bases, armored vehicles, and defensive lines. The Taliban struggled to respond. Many of their forces lacked modern equipment and could not effectively counter American air superiority. Bombing campaigns destroyed command centers, weapons depots, and training camps connected to Al-Qaeda and Taliban operations. As airstrikes intensified, Northern Alliance fighters launched ground offensives across northern Afghanistan. Taliban defensive positions collapsed rapidly. Major cities began falling one after another. In November 2001, Northern Alliance forces entered Kabul, Afghanistan's capital city, after Taliban fighters retreated southward. Crowds gathered in parts of the city as Taliban control suddenly disappeared after years of harsh rule. Around the world, many observers were shocked by how quickly the Taliban government seemed to crumble. American officials declared the early stages of the operation a major success. The Taliban leadership fled into remote regions while surviving Al-Qaeda fighters escaped toward mountain strongholds near the Pakistan border. U.S. forces believed they were closing in on Osama bin Laden himself. Attention soon focused on the mountains of Tora Bora. Intelligence reports suggested bin Laden and senior Al-Qaeda leaders were hiding inside heavily defended cave complexes in eastern Afghanistan. American aircraft bombed the region relentlessly while Afghan militia forces and U.S. Special Operations teams attempted to surround escape routes. The battle became one of the most important moments of the early war. Massive explosions shook the mountains as bombs targeted tunnels and suspected terrorist hideouts. Yet despite the intense assault, many Al-Qaeda fighters managed to escape through difficult mountain terrain leading into neighboring Pakistan. Most importantly, Osama bin Laden disappeared. His escape would become one of the most controversial failures of the early Afghanistan campaign. Critics later argued that insufficient American ground troops allowed key terrorist leaders to evade capture during the crucial first months of the war. Meanwhile, Afghanistan itself was already suffering deeply from the conflict. Civilians found themselves trapped between Taliban fighters, airstrikes, and advancing militias. Families fled combat zones while refugee camps expanded across the region. Years of previous war had already devastated Afghanistan's infrastructure, and the new invasion added fresh destruction to an already broken country. Still, in the United States, public support for the war remained extremely strong. After the trauma of 9/11, many Americans viewed the invasion as a necessary act of self-defense. Military victories during the first months created optimism that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda could be defeated quickly. Operation Enduring Freedom also showcased a new era of warfare. Precision-guided bombs, drones, satellite intelligence, and real-time battlefield communication demonstrated the technological power of the modern American military. Television broadcasts showed dramatic footage of airstrikes and special operations missions unlike anything seen in earlier wars. To many observers, it appeared the United States had achieved a rapid and decisive victory. By the end of 2001, the Taliban government had been removed from power, major cities were under Allied control, and Al-Qaeda training camps had been destroyed. But beneath the surface, serious problems remained unresolved. Taliban fighters had not disappeared completely. Many escaped into rural areas, mountains, and safe havens across the Pakistan border. Afghanistan's political future remained uncertain while tribal divisions, corruption, and instability continued threatening the country. What seemed like the end of the war was actually only the beginning. The rapid invasion had toppled a government within weeks, but building lasting peace inside Afghanistan would prove far more difficult than defeating the Taliban on the battlefield. And as American forces expanded their mission beyond counterterrorism into nation-building and long-term occupation, Operation Enduring Freedom slowly transformed into a conflict that would last for nearly 2 decades. After the rapid of the Taliban government in late 2001, many American officials believed the war in Afghanistan was nearly over. Major cities had fallen. Taliban fighters had retreated. Al-Qaeda training camps were destroyed. And the United States had demonstrated overwhelming military power within weeks of launching Operation Enduring Freedom. But beneath the surface, the conflict was far from finished. The Taliban had not been completely defeated. Instead of fighting large conventional battles, surviving Taliban fighters disappeared into Afghanistan's mountains, deserts, and remote villages. Others crossed the border into Pakistan, where they regrouped, recruited new fighters, and prepared for a long insurgency against American and NATO forces. Slowly the war began changing shape. What started as a fast-moving invasion transformed into a brutal guerrilla conflict with no clear front lines. Taliban fighters avoided direct battles and instead launched ambushes, bombings, and surprise attacks designed to wear down foreign troops over time. Roadside bombs became one of the deadliest threats. Improvised explosive devices, known as IEDs, were hidden along roads, bridges, and patrol routes across Afghanistan. Convoys carrying American soldiers could be struck without warning, turning ordinary patrols into deadly missions. The psychological pressure on troops intensified constantly. Soldiers faced invisible enemies capable of attacking at any moment before disappearing into nearby villages or mountain terrain. Every road, vehicle, and building became a potential danger zone. At the same time, the Taliban steadily rebuilt its influence. Using tribal connections, religious networks, intimidation, and propaganda, insurgent groups regained control over parts of rural Afghanistan. In many villages, Taliban fighters operated openly at night even while NATO forces controlled nearby cities during the day. The geography of Afghanistan made the war even harder. Towering mountains, isolated valleys, harsh deserts, and weak infrastructure created enormous challenges for military operations. American and Allied troops often fought in regions where roads barely existed and communication was extremely limited. The conflict also became increasingly international. The United States was joined by forces from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and other Allied countries participating in counterterrorism and stabilization missions. Yet despite advanced technology and military strength, victory remained elusive. Building a stable Afghan government proved far more difficult than removing the Taliban from power. Corruption spread throughout Afghan political institutions while warlords, tribal rivalries, and weak security forces undermined efforts to create long-term stability. Meanwhile, the Taliban insurgency kept growing stronger. Suicide bombings increased across Afghanistan. Government buildings, military bases, schools, and civilian areas became targets of attacks. Afghan civilians often suffered the most as violence spread throughout the country year after year. The human cost of the war continued rising. Thousands of Afghan civilians were killed or displaced during fighting between insurgents and coalition forces. Entire communities lived under constant fear while refugee crises expanded across the region. American troops also faced enormous strain. Many soldiers served multiple deployments in Afghanistan over the course of the war. Long separations from family, constant combat stress, and repeated exposure to violence created lasting physical and psychological trauma for veterans returning home. As the years passed, public optimism about the war began fading. What had initially appeared to be a quick military victory slowly transformed into America's longest war. At the same time, another major conflict changed the direction of U.S. foreign policy. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, opening a second major war during the broader War on Terror. Critics later argued that shifting military resources and political focus toward Iraq weakened efforts to stabilize Afghanistan during critical years of the insurgency. Meanwhile, one question remained unanswered. Where was Osama bin Laden? For years, Bin Laden remained hidden despite one of the largest manhunts in modern history. His survival became symbolic of the unfinished nature of the war itself. The conflict also generated growing controversy around American military tactics. Drone strikes and air power became increasingly important tools in counterterrorism operations. Unmanned aircraft targeted suspected Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders across Afghanistan and neighboring regions. Supporters argued drone warfare reduced risks for American troops and eliminated dangerous terrorist figures. Critics argued civilian casualties and mistaken strikes fueled anger, resentment, and anti-American sentiment among local populations. Human rights organizations raised concerns about transparency, accountability, and the long-term consequences of remote warfare. The debate over detention centers and interrogation methods also intensified. Facilities such as Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp became global symbols of controversy surrounding the war on terror. Questions about torture, prisoner treatment, and civil liberties sparked international criticism against U.S. counterterrorism policies. Inside Afghanistan, the violence showed little sign of ending. Taliban fighters adapted continuously to American military strategies. Whenever coalition forces cleared insurgent-controlled areas, militants often returned after foreign troops withdrew. By the late 2000s, American commanders warned that the war was reaching a critical stage. President Barack Obama authorized a major troop surge aimed at weakening the insurgency and stabilizing Afghanistan. Thousands of additional American troops deployed into dangerous combat zones as military operations intensified once again. Some tactical gains were achieved. But even as coalition forces killed insurgent leaders and cleared Taliban strongholds, the deeper political problems inside Afghanistan remained unresolved. Then, in 2011, came one of the most significant moments of the entire war on terror. After years of intelligence operations and secret surveillance, American special forces located Osama bin Laden inside Pakistan. During a nighttime raid conducted by United States Navy SEALs, bin Laden was killed. The operation marked a symbolic victory for the United States. By the late 2010s, the war in Afghanistan had entered its second decade. What began after the September 11th attacks as a mission to destroy Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban had become America's longest war. Thousands of soldiers had been killed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians had suffered. And trillions of dollars had been spent. Yet despite years of fighting, Afghanistan remained unstable. The Taliban insurgency continued controlling large rural areas while Afghan government forces struggled with corruption, low morale, and dependence on foreign military support. Many Americans began questioning whether the war could ever truly be won. War fatigue spread across the United States. Families had watched loved ones deploy repeatedly over nearly 20 years of conflict. Veterans returned home carrying physical injuries and psychological trauma while public support for the war steadily declined. Political leaders increasingly searched for a way to end the conflict. Negotiations with the Taliban slowly began behind closed doors. For years, direct talks would have seemed impossible because the Taliban had originally been the enemy America invaded Afghanistan to remove. But after nearly 2 decades of war, diplomacy became the only realistic path toward withdrawal. The most important negotiations took place in Doha, Qatar. American officials and Taliban representatives discussed terms for ending the conflict, reducing violence, and withdrawing foreign troops from Afghanistan. In 2020, the United States signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. The deal outlined a timeline for the withdrawal of American and allied forces in exchange for Taliban promises related to counterterrorism and future peace discussions inside Afghanistan. But many experts warned the situation remained fragile. Afghan government leaders were not fully included in parts of the negotiations, and critics feared the Taliban was simply waiting for foreign troops to leave before launching a final offensive. Meanwhile, violence continued across Afghanistan. Bombings, assassinations, and clashes between Afghan security forces and Taliban fighters persisted even as international withdrawal plans moved forward. Then came 2021. President Joe Biden announced that American troops would fully withdraw from Afghanistan, bringing the longest war in U.S. history to an end. As foreign forces prepared to leave, the Taliban launched a massive nationwide offensive. City after city began falling with shocking speed. Afghan military units surrendered, retreated, or collapsed entirely as Taliban fighters captured provinces across the country. Many observers were stunned by how rapidly the Afghan government weakened after years of American training and financial support. Then in August 2021 the impossible happened. The Taliban entered Kabul. The Afghan government collapsed almost overnight while President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. 20 years after being removed from power during the initial invasion, the Taliban once again controlled Afghanistan. The scenes that followed shocked the world. Thousands of desperate civilians rushed toward Kabul's international airport hoping to escape before Taliban control fully tightened. Families crowded runways while foreign governments launched emergency evacuation operations under chaotic and dangerous conditions. Television footage showed people clinging to military aircraft, massive crowds pressing against airport gates, and armed soldiers struggling to maintain order amid panic and confusion. The evacuation became one of the most dramatic moments of the entire war. American troops who had spent years fighting in Afghanistan were now focused on evacuating diplomats, civilians, journalists, and Afghan allies before the final withdrawal deadline. Then tragedy struck once again. During the evacuation operation, a suicide bombing outside Kabul airport killed dozens of Afghan civilians and multiple American service members. The attack demonstrated how unstable and dangerous the situation remained even during the war's final days. Soon afterward, the last American military aircraft departed Afghanistan. Operation Enduring Freedom, and the broader American war in Afghanistan, had officially ended. But the ending left deep controversy and unresolved questions. Critics argued the withdrawal was poorly managed and damaged America's global reputation. Others believed ending the war was necessary after 2 decades of endless conflict with no clear path to victory. The collapse of the Afghan government also sparked intense debate. How could a government supported by the United States for 20 years fall so quickly? Why had Afghan security forces collapsed despite massive funding and military training? And had the sacrifices made during the war achieved lasting results? For many Afghans, the future suddenly became uncertain once again. Women's rights, education, political freedoms, and economic stability faced serious challenges under renewed Taliban rule. Thousands of Afghans who had worked alongside Western forces feared retaliation and struggled to escape the country. The human cost of the war was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people, including civilians, soldiers, aid workers, journalists, and insurgents, lost their lives during 2 decades of conflict. Millions more were displaced while entire generations grew up knowing only war and instability. Financially, the cost reached staggering levels. The United States spent trillions of dollars on military operations, reconstruction programs, intelligence activities, and long-term veteran care connected to the war in Afghanistan. Operation Enduring Freedom also transformed global counterterrorism strategy forever. The conflict accelerated the use of drones, special operations raids, surveillance systems, cyber intelligence, and modern counterinsurgency tactics. Governments around the world expanded anti-terror laws and security measures after September 11 and the wars that followed. At the same time, the war raised difficult moral and political questions. Could military power alone defeat terrorism? Can foreign nations successfully rebuild unstable countries through military occupation? And how should democracies balance national security with civil liberties during times of fear and conflict? For American veterans, the legacy of Afghanistan remains deeply personal. Many lost friends, endured repeated deployments, and witnessed the emotional toll of endless war firsthand.